participants are trickling in on Zoom and YouTube, and I would just like to use the first couple of seconds while Zoom is still loading to point out that the Friedrich Naumann Foundation offers a Mediathek of Freiheit Plus, and there you can find this event and a lot of other great events from the past 1.5 years. You might want to check it out, but please only after we're done today. So much for a start. I must say the group is not yet complete here. One of our guests unfortunately went offline because the connection wasn't stable, as it looks. But we are ready to start anyway. And today, if you're joining us through Zoom, and if you don't have a direct link to YouTube, then you can choose whether you want to hear everything in German or in English. Daniel Schönwitz and myself, we will speak German, which is our mother tongue. Mphatso Jumbe, who had already joined us from Malawi and hopefully will be back in a moment, will speak English, even though this is not her native tongue, which is not surprising in Africa, but she speaks it perfectly well. So you can either hear the German original here or our simultaneous translation into English. So where you see the F&A function that you can use to ask questions to the participants, there you can basically choose. Right next to the F&A function, you can choose whether you want to listen to the German or the English stream. I don't know if it says übersetzen or dolmetschen in German or interpretation in English. And then you can choose whatever setting you favor. Unfortunately, Ms. Jumbe is not yet back, but we should show a quick video that shows her, because we'll be speaking about Afrika First in a moment, and the question whether the social market economy is the right answer to the problems on the African continent. And we'll look at it from a German and from a European perspective, together with Daniel Schönwitz. We're going to talk about that, and we, or the colleagues from the International Friedrich Naumann Foundation, have produced a video with Mphatso Edna Jumbe. We're not going to watch it in full, but at least you can see her for a moment. And she will make a statement there which is also relevant to our session tonight. Let me just play it for you.
For African nations to move ahead, we have a double burden. We have the governance systems that we adopted from the colonial times, and we have our own governance system. If we don't assess ourselves to ask ourselves, how do we develop as Africans, we will always have a foreign conversation within our spaces, and we will try as much as possible to convince ourselves that that which is foreign will work for us, which never does. Every young person has an obligation to develop their nation. It doesn't matter whether you're a woman or not. Sure, it's tougher for a female. It's much tougher for...
Das war jetzt nur ein ganz kurzer Einblick.
This was just a snapshot. So you just saw Mphatso Edna Jumbe. She's an activist for women's rights in Malawi, in the southwest of Africa, or the southeast of Africa, actually. And she is also the owner of a dairy factory that she inherited. And she will be joining us in a moment. But let me now introduce our second guest tonight, Daniel Schönwitz. Basically, the message is this is the message from Mphatso. The Africans need to take their fate into their own hands, and they need to make sure that they do the right thing for their countries and their communities. Now, you, Daniel, you have written a book together with Martin Schoeller. The title is Afrika First. Now, I'm guessing it's a slightly confusing title at first, but I'm guessing that's what you wanted. But there's a shake hands there on the cover. Oh, I think Mphatso is joining us now again. There's a shake hands on the cover, which shows that it's about doing things together rather than against each other. And Dr. Gerd Müller, the current development minister in Germany, and Antonella May-Pochter, who is an advisor to the Austrian Chancellor, wrote the introduction to this book. Maybe you could say a few words about this book and maybe also a few words about your co-author. You yourself are not an entrepreneur. In fact, you're a journalist, one of the most renowned journalists at the interface between the worlds of economy and politics. And I think, so you have a lot of skills, but why did you write a book about Africa or the relationship between Africa and Europe? Thank you very much, Christoph. The book was written at the initiative of Martin Schoeller, a very prominent owner of a family enterprise. And as a young man, he used to work in Africa. He is also active today in various developing countries. And he set up the so-called Desert Food Foundation together with his family, which provides farmers in Africa with state-of-the-art technology. And a couple of years ago, he was asked whether he wanted to become the honorary consul of the Republic of Togo. And he says, yes, but I don't just want to have a nice title, he said, I also want to take part in the political dialogue. And this is an option that was conceded, so he became honorary consul of Togo, and he has established contacts with the Ministry of Development, and he tried to find sparring partners for his ideas, and then he was looking for someone to write the book with. And as a business journalist and a publicist myself, I said that would be a good thing for me. When I studied economics, I already looked into, economies of emerging markets, and that was the start of Afrika First. We spent almost 3 years working on the book. We intensely debated things, came up with new ideas, discarded them again, and then at the end of the year we were done. And now the reality looks different again. But it was an exciting project that I enjoyed very much. And yeah, I very much like dealing with development policies. Okay, an official welcome to Mphatso. Welcome back. We've used the time when you're offline to briefly show your video, just an extract. And I was explaining to our viewers what you are doing. And we'll get back to you in a moment, Mphatso. I would just like to ask 2 more questions to Daniel. Daniel, you've developed a couple of core hypotheses. It's important to understand that you believe that the social market economy, not socialism, not imposing something on people like the Chinese do, and not a form of radical capitalism are the right solution to Africa. That's your hypothesis. They're not, but a free market economy. And I was wondering, is this such a new idea to begin with? Maybe you could comment on that. Would you consider this a surprising approach? And secondly, the revival of the historical spice route. This is something else that you came up with. Would you like to take us on this journey? Well, on your first point, the social market economy, we are convinced that a real development takes 2 things. First of all, a strong and sustainable growth. degrowth debates are only something for privileged people who don't know poverty and hunger. And secondly, you need to put mechanisms in place that make it possible for large parts of the population to really benefit from growth and progress. And that's where the social market economy comes into place, or into play rather, because it also comes with social security systems. And the point is, it all sounds so obvious to us in Europe, but in Africa, 30 years ago, we had the so-called Washington Consensus, where the global community, including basically pressurized 40 African states into, say, neoliberal reforms, deliberalization, etc. And this was done by the Thatcher-Reagan policy back then, saying, all we need is strong growth. But the second really important aspect, social security, was neglected. And that's why, yes, growth was triggered, but only small parts of the population in Africa really benefited from it. And this again led to more inequality and more instability. And that's why we believe this is an important message. And even in liberal communities, some people wonder that social security may be something like socialism and may stop growth. We disagree. We believe it really triggers more growth. And if people have a minimum of social security, they are more likely to improve their education, and consumption will also rise as a result. And birth rates would also go down, because you would no longer have to rely on large families to survive. And that's why, you know, more prosperity in the African states is also a big driver behind bringing the birth rates down. And we're not, you know, telling this story in Europe in an arrogant fashion, saying you should do that in a patronizing way. This is already happening, still at a low level, but it has already begun. And the idea behind Afrika First is to ask, how can we now support these reform states in a tailored way? We don't want to patronize them. We don't want to tell them what they have to do, but we want to lend them our tailored support. And here, financing infrastructure is one of the keys. And yes, you're right. We are talking about the Spice Route 2.0. This is like a traditional trade route that used to connect the two continents. And we believe that this could also be established as a counterweight to the Chinese Silk Route, which is a new initiative on the part of the Chinese, and which is very much geared to expanding China's influence on the world. And you know, this will have a bearing on global digital standards and future technologies. And it also comes with the funding of infrastructure in Africa. And we need to do something as well, because infrastructure is the basis for sustainable development. This is how strong companies can thrive. Infrastructure is the very start of it all. And in Europe, we have the means to invest capital in infrastructure in Africa in a tailored way. And the core message of Afrika First is, let's make the most of this opportunity. Thank you very much. Mphatso. Now that you've heard all that, would you say that's in line or matches your experience? I mean, you look at things from different points of view. You spent 15 years in the US yourself, so you are familiar with the so-called West. You are an activist, you are a defender of women's rights, a feminist. You are politically active in the liberal spectrum. You are an entrepreneur, a businesswoman. You don't live in the capital. You don't even live in a big city. You live in the countryside, right? So you are dealing with a completely kind of people than the liberal elite that you can find in the big capitals around the world. So from your different points of view, what's your first spontaneous reaction on what Daniel said?
Well, I would say it's quite a hazing experience. It's very correct when you say that I lived in the US. So basically, I've spent my adulthood, I've grown up in the West. And I think I have a unique positionality. As Daniel is speaking, I feel split into two people. There's that identity that I really can identify with. You know, it's beautiful to talk about different types of philosophies and principles of growth and how we can move as the globe. But I always ask myself, as Daniel is speaking, how much African voice is in Afrika First? How much of myself do I see within this conversation? So, like you rightly put it, I now live in the village. And when I look at development, I look at it now as a very complex issue. So I think it's such a privilege to line the dots and talk about the global trade and the history and the politics. But when we talk about all that, we hardly see the position of Africa. I think sometimes we are really talking about the geopolitics amongst players in the Western countries, but we're not really talking about Africans. We're not really hearing the African voice. So when I came back to Malawi, one of the things that I found very difficult to adjust to was the slow pace in this country. And as I live here, I've begun to really appreciate the slowness of life compared to the activity and the pressures that I faced when I was in the US. And I asked myself, what should development look like? And especially post-COVID, when our economies have been basically in a standstill and forced us to really reflect on what does development look like? So yes, infrastructure is very important, but the things that we hear are constantly the same. So I asked myself, what about the young person who is in the village? So for example, when we talk about development, when we talk about infrastructure, we talk about education, we talk about the same things that are going to propel growth and propel sustainability. But then when you talk about my community, these things are way far off. I have lived in my village now for 7 years. And for example, there's this global conversation, a global push to end child marriage. And I am also split between my urban community, the elite, the more educated people who are also pro-Western, who also look into the global policies and the global conversation and the global movement. But when I look at my village, taking a girl out of an early marriage really simply doesn't make any sense. I know it sounds shocking, but I always ask myself, you take the girl out of the marriage, you put her into school, and then there's nothing around her. She can't find employment. She can't become an entrepreneur. She's not as privileged as I am. Where does she go? What does development look like then for somebody like that girl in my village, that young man in my village? When I ask them, what is it that you want to be when you grow up? So majority of them are not in school. What is it that you want to do? I want to do exactly what my dad does, which is like molding bricks. Imagine how far behind that is, the distance between what we're talking about now and where that child is in my village. So I really think that it's very important to think progressively, to think of how we are moving ahead. But I think what's essential is that we must ask ourselves as human beings, as liberals, that what is freedom? What is development? And does that look the same for all of us? And if it doesn't look the same for all of us, then how do we still build this collective global citizenship? Thank you.
Daniel, willst du direkt darauf antworten? Oder,
Daniel, would you like to respond to this straight away? You're still on mute. Okay, so I didn't mute my mic, but you did. Good. I understand what Mphatso is saying. And yes, of course, we need to have an Africa-centered perspective, but we look at it from the outside. We asked ourselves, how can we redesign European development policies and how can we provide fresh impetus? And then maybe this triggers something which hopefully at some stage will also reach the rural areas in Africa. And I'm not just talking about some nice advice, some good tips. I mean, those reforming Africa know best themselves what they need. Okay, but Daniel, sorry, if I may. We have the two hands here on the cover page of your book, and it's a shake hands. So it says Africa first, but then there's Europe and Africa together. And Africa and Europe need to be thought as one, right? But why? How so? Well, we are convinced that we need each other more than ever. And Europe is relatively small, you know, when you look at the long-term geographic and economic developments, then in the long run, we will rely more on big Africa than the other way around. And that's mainly for three reasons. And this brings me back to the geopolitical level. And that's how we look at things. First of all, people are escaping. In 2015 and 2016, we saw that there were a lot of migrants coming to Europe, which shook up the European democracies, and populists took advantage of that. Secondly, in Africa, there's the climate crisis, of course, particularly strong, and this also prompts a lot of people to flee. And the strong growth that we are expecting in many African states, Malawi next year, the forecast is more than 6%, by 2023. So if there is strong growth in Africa, in line with rising emissions, then we can do what we want in Germany. Then our achievements in bringing emissions down will be offset by what's happening in Africa. That's why we really need to invest a great deal in renewable energies. And the third point, the third factor is China. You know, this rising economic and political superpower, which is trying to expand its grip in a very aggressive way. And to us, it's clear that the relatively small Europe needs partners, including new partners, in order to be able to co-shape these global standards in the future. And that's crucial to an export nation such as Germany in particular. And our vision is, we're saying that the African reform states are the ideal partners for us, and that we need to develop and can develop a thriving economic area there based on freedom. And I'm not talking about the kind of capitalism that is imposed by countries such as China. So it's politically driven, but it is also a freedom project, our freedom, because we're saying investments in the African-European partnership ultimately are investments in our freedom. In 2013, I was in Africa last time. That was in Ghana. The other end, I mean, Africa is a huge continent, you know, with just under 50 countries. And just like someone from Germany can't speak for, say, Russia, Mphatso can't speak for the whole of Africa, of course. But Mphatso, nonetheless, I would like to ask you anyway, in Ghana, you arrive at the airport, then you go downtown and you only see Chinese letters. And there are a lot of three-wheelers, you know, which are used by a lot of traders. They also come from China, often from India as well. And so these are countries which used to be in a similar situation some 20 years ago. So they probably know what sort of products are needed. And I thought it was quite interesting back then that everybody was using mobile phones with 2 SIM cards. And I came across a lot of brands from China. They sometimes had 3 or 4 SIM cards because the network was constantly down. And I remember there was one shop with Samsung phones and nobody needed them because they only had 1 SIM card slot. So, Mphatso, question. In Malawi, is it clear that the Chinese are having a major influence, or is that not the case? And maybe you could generally comment on the situation in Malawi. What is the government doing? What is the political situation? You yourself are a liberal activist. What is your opinion on the politics in your country?
Okay, we do have a big Chinese presence in Malawi. As a matter of fact, I've been a dairy farmer for 7 years. For the 7 years, I have failed to purchase a grass cutter. And this year, I just purchased one from a Chinese guy. And he's definitely going to become my partner so I can find those same machines for other farmers in my area. It's interesting. I think that our countries are definitely not isolated. The types of politics that we have is usually influenced by people who are more privileged and more powerful. So it's very interesting as I'm hearing Daniel speak about the position of Germany. And I tell you, I really wish Malawi was also in the same position to facilitate its own political position. Obviously, because Malawi is not economically powerful, it can't do that. So when we talk about Germany, so when you talk about the migrants who went to Germany, for example, for me as a young African, it's painful to see Africans leave Africa, die on the way just to get to Europe to get a better life. I really think it's our obligation as Africans to have an organic conversation about our own politics, our organic conversation about our own development. Because when we talk about German partnership, and even if we talk about it from a socioeconomy perspective, it's still a German perspective. It's not a Malawian perspective. So when you go down on the ground, on the grassroots level, you will find that a lot of our development is influenced by outside pressures. So you can see that even if Germany is coming into Malawi, it's in response to its own needs. It's in response to its own geopolitical position. It's in response to the pressures that it's seeing from China. But where is the African response to the geopolitical shift? So for me, as an African, I get concerned because I see major land ownership by the Chinese, major investment in manufacturing, in agriculture. I can see that. And now in a country like ours, when I look at the next generation of Malawians who are also going to wake up either with the German influence or the Chinese influence or the American influence, I wonder how much of their own freedom they can really assert. I wonder how much of their own wish to develop or define their own progress. How do we do that? So for example, I am a Ngoni. So in Malawi, we also have our own dynamics. We have a formal political system, a formal governance system, which is a British system. Then we have our own traditional governance systems, which are different when you go into different tribal areas. So I'm Ngoni. And in our country, we are also going through shifts. Our language, the Ngoni language, is just going on TV now. So we are also having our own growth dynamics, our own questions on how do we engage as Malawians, because we are also diverse. So then how does that conversation happen with the Germans? Do the Germans come on the ground and talk to Malawi and ask what is the organic conversation in Malawi? What is Malawi wishing to do? Our 2063 agenda when we talk about the African Union integration, where is the influence coming from? So if we are going to have a progressive world and we really want to establish a sustainable world, we cannot run away from the complexities. First, as Daniel puts it, from the global pressures that we are seeing from China, from everybody trying to position themselves for what looks like a great Africa ahead. But when we talk about the great Africa ahead, who is benefiting? When we talk about Malawi is projected to grow, who is benefiting? Are Malawians owning that money, or is somebody else owning that money? When we talk about growth and progress, are we talking about GDP, or are we talking about a quality of life? What is it that we're talking about? And I think that's quite essential. So in our country, I think that there's always an influence from outside. So if you're going to get aid, you must also play the tune towards who is giving you the money, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the Germans. But I think it's very good that Daniel is talking about the influx of young Africans into Germany. I think that has shown us as a globe, as an international community, that when one area is not developed, is not progressive, another area will suffer for it. So I think it's also very important for international partners to put the pressure on Africans to do the thinking themselves, to progress, to contribute. And I think that is our job as Africans, to contribute to the larger international development.
Daniel, ich weiß, dass du jetzt schon antworten willst.
I know that you want to answer straight away, Daniel. And I'm guessing that your positions aren't too far apart, but there's a follow-up question. And maybe it's moving in the same direction. Daniel said that in Europe, or in the States and in the Western world, there are debates about degrowth. So instead of seeking growth, we should do the opposite for reasons of sustainability and climate protection. I'm assuming that from an African point of view, this is an absurd debate. Or this is my first question to you, Mphatso. And then Daniel said, secondly, that it was wrong to always bank only on growth because that growth came without social security. And when you, Mphatso, talk about that the standard of living is improving from an African perspective, then I'm wondering, what does that mean specifically? Do you mean that in terms of product availability, that products have become cheaper, which would bring us back to China probably? Or are you talking about improvements in the social security system so that certain risks in life are now better insured than they used to be? This would be in line with the social market economy. Or do you mean something else? Then it would be very interesting to know what that is.
Okay, so first, when I was talking about the availability of products, of course, it's a Chinese push, but that's also a larger global trend that you go out and you find markets. I like the idea, what Daniel was talking about, that now in Europe, in the US, people are now talking about degrowth. Sometimes I think it's quite interesting because I think we go into cycles. There's a saying in my language that says, like whatever goes up must come down. And I think that whether we like it or not, we live within nature. So the degrowth is also an appreciation that everything is limited. We really cannot push the environment or land or resources to whatever limits, that we want to go. We are limited by universal laws, and that's just how it is. So the question of social security, I as I was growing up, my idea of development meant that you lived in a very good neighborhood with tarmac, and you had electricity and you had water in your taps. So as I am growing and I'm asking myself the same questions, I asked my grandmother, who has always lived in the village, if she was ever poor. Because when you go out into the rural area, there's no tarmac, there's no electricity. So she said to me, she was never poor. And I said, how come? She said she had land. And for as long as she was productive, she always had what she needed. And then that really challenged my idea of progress. About 3-4 years ago, I visited her in a village, and I found that there was no single young person to help her with chores around the house. Now she had to pay for all the services that she needed in her household, to the extent that she had to move from the village to go live with one of my aunts in town. Now, when we talk about social security, I really think that the African way of living in the village was like perfect in terms of social security, because even though there was no cash, but there was an economy, whether it was barter trade, there was an economy, but people lived much more connected. They supported one another. People who were older always had people to help them. But as now, when we are talking progress and we are talking urbanization, I think that we don't have a social security system. We are almost developing the way the West has developed. I remember meeting a German couple in Lilongwe. Their daughter was volunteering in one of the organizations, and we were having breakfast together. And they had just retired. And they said that it was so nice to be in Malawi because the pace was so slow. They were tired of working like machines, and which is the same experience that I had in the US. So I think it's quite daunting for us as human beings, because we would want to believe that there are solutions that are going to come to a conclusion, and then we are going to live in a modern, progressive way for every single human being in the globe. But I don't believe that that's possible. I think for me, I was quite irrelevant of nature, of agriculture. When I became a farmer, I realized that if it did not rain, I would suffer great loss on my farm. And it also made me realize that if it did not rain, I really would not have any water. So if there was no rain for 5 years, that would mean that we would see real human devastation. No matter what type of gadgets you have, no matter what type of arms you have, no matter what type of security you have, nature is so important. So when we talk about degrowth, it is key to the survival of the whole planet, because the sun that shines in Germany is not different from the one that shines in Africa. But the question should be, how safe or secure were people who were living in quote unquote primitive ways, like my grandmother did? I experienced it. I would go to the village. Well, they didn't have motors, they didn't have electricity, but the community was well knit. Today, in our cities, we're experiencing, like I said, the same thing that Western countries are experiencing. So when we're talking about growth in Africa, it's challenging. So people are talking about taking care of the environment, which I think we are quite privileged as Africans, because like for Malawi, about 80% of people are living in the rural areas. They're living on their own lands. We don't have big manufacturing companies that would pollute the air. So would you not really say that like that's the best situation? But when you look at development from the ease perspective, so I am talking to you now in Germany and I'm in Malawi, and we can have this conversation where somebody who is my neighbor can't have that conversation. So when we talk about development in terms of ease of communication, convenience, we can say that is progress. But at the same time, the same progress is also costly to our environment. Our response to COVID was urgent, but also the masks that we've been using have been a pollution to the environment. So we are living in a larger globe, in a larger universe that really pays no attention to us, but it gives us the rules and laws by which we must live as human beings. And if we do not live by them, then we see larger devastating consequences that we are seeing across the world. So for me, I think it's easier to say this policy and that policy is going to correct things, but I think things are a bit more complex. Again, I think the question should always be, when we are developing or when we're talking about development, is it human-centered? Or are we protecting ourselves? Is this based on security? Is this based on power? Is this based on influence? What is it based on? So as a liberal politician, I ask myself the same question. What is freedom to me? What is freedom to other people? What is development to me? So when I am on my farms breathing clean air, that is essentially very important to me, because if you're not breathing clean air, then you are a burden on the health system. If you're breathing clean air, you might not be such a burden on the health system. So I think there are consequences to all types of choices that we make. There is none that is a super choice that is going to fix a lot of global problems, because even the choices that we're making in terms of progress, in terms of partnerships, it's in response to who is going to influence, who is going to be the big superpower. And this time people don't want China, but who's going to replace China? And what are they going to bring? So for me, I still say that as an African, I live on the African continent. I hear people say Africa is the next big thing. And I ask myself, am I getting the next big thing? Am I the one who's getting the next big thing? Or is it somebody else? Are we still going to see people who are going to come invest in Africa and benefit from it while we watch? So again, will that stop the migration? Will that will that really deal with the problems that Africa has and actually develop organically so that our development is sustainable? I think that's still a big question.
Daniel, dann lass uns doch genau mit der letzten Frage starten.
So, Daniel, let's start with this last question. You are an expert when it comes to development policies and how they impact on economy. How about other regions of the world? Are there examples that what you are suggesting turned out to be a success, where you would say, yeah, this actually led to progress for the people, not just the small elite? I think success is often measured in that there is a middle class. Well, we've looked at countries in Asia and Latin America that have gone beyond the status of emerging markets, and you can see that social market economy is working there. And also in China, incidentally, but in a completely different way. But they are also establishing the next phase of the social security system. Nonetheless, let me disagree on two things that we've heard. First of all, the degrowth debate certainly sounds romantic, but isn't. And I think when it comes to, the use of resources must be decoupled from environmental pollution. But without growth, we will not be able to increase average income. Without growth, we will not be able to move away from poverty. I mean, the motto, of course, needs to be green growth and inclusive growth, but not degrowth. To me, this is a very important distinction and an important lever for overcoming poverty. And without growth, that won't be possible. And we also experienced that in Germany following the economic miracle after the war. Then what you said about development policy is right. Of course, you're right that development policy shouldn't be about somebody exerting influence from the outside. You were saying that, you know, some people are doing that, but of course, that's not how geopolitics is supposed to work. And we don't want to do what China are doing. Our approach is, and this is what we want from German politicians and EU politicians, our approach is to say that those countries that are on the way to improving things, that are doing the right thing from our point of view, should be given tailored support. And almost all countries that are working, that Germany is working with, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Togo, as part of the relevant programs, you know, are seeking capital to invest in their various initiatives. So we support tailored offerings without getting too much involved. We don't want to build things there. We just want to mobilize private capital for whom it may concern. That's an offer. We are stretching out our hand to establish an investment partnership. And of course, we would do that together with the local development partners. And I mean, there is a great deal of mistrust, and I can see why. I understand that, because obviously there was the colonial era, and that had terrible consequences. And then some people still refer to white saviorism, a patronizing attitude in Europe, where a lot of people seem to believe that they know what's right for Africa. And unfortunately, this was also part of traditional development aid for a long time. Unfortunately, we have to say that in the past, development aid often wasn't about aid to self-aid, but just as a remedy. So self-initiative wasn't really promoted in the past. I think it was even smothered. And therefore, it's important that Germany and our development minister Müller have now basically moved away from this traditional concept of development aid. There's a book called Bad Aid that describes very specifically what this means. Liberals often say that development aid is always bad and always has negative consequences. I wouldn't say that. I would say it often had good consequences, but it often met certain limits. And now I think we need to empower people. We need to make sure that entrepreneurs, business people get a chance to set up their own business, to create new jobs, to invest. And that's why we are saying this is something that needs to be more closely interlinked, i.e. economic promotion and development aid. Okay, I have one follow-up question on that. How is this supposed to work? I mean, how do you want to get private capital to Africa? In the past, that often turned out to be money down the drain. When you invested in the stock market, then the return certainly wasn't the same as in the Western world. And at the same time, investing as a European in Africa often didn't turn out to be, say, a piece of cake, to say the least. And, some people have made some experience there that makes it difficult. And that's why a lot of investors basically withdrew, because it didn't work. So how can we make sure that private capital is invested in Africa, that the Africans are then supposed to, to leverage? Well, in Afrika First, we are suggesting infrastructure bonds, which are issued by African states to finance their infrastructure projects. And European institutions, such as the European Investment Bank, could provide the relevant guarantees. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we are lending money to the African states. We would just lend our creditworthiness, if you like. And I'm sure that we'd be able to mobilize a great deal of capital. Okay, I think you looked at how they tried to solve the euro crisis in Europe, right, as a model. Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, we would come up with tailored offerings, not general bonds. But yes, we've also learned from that in Europe, from the Euro crisis here, and there may be parallels. And look at the low interest rates in Europe, in fact, worldwide. Now, there are a lot of institutional investors who are desperately looking for investment opportunities because stock and real estate are extremely expensive. So that's an ideal situation. What we need is smart new concepts. For instance, infrastructure bonds, including green bonds for green infrastructure. This will also be part of the new G7 initiative for the development of infrastructure in emerging markets. So capital can be mobilized for that. And this is something else that I quite like. Our KfW bank, for instance, has also issued funds, and as part of it, the government is taking a lot of the risk, which is good for the investors. And through these funds, our partner states like Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Togo, to name just a few, can then, apply for microcredits, for instance, the business people there. And also in the agricultural sector, by the way, which I think is crucial because we will only overcome hunger if we are investing more in agriculture. So a lot has been brought on the way. And on a final note, in the North, we always tend to just talk about the catastrophes and all the things that go wrong on the African continent. And I think we are overlooking the progress that a lot of African countries have already made. And let's be quite clear here that it does make sense to invest in a lot of these African countries. It sometimes makes me chuckle when people say, yeah, but there's no legal security in Africa, is there? Well, in China, nobody cares about legal security. I mean, they're all investing their money in China, even though there's no legal security there. And I think it certainly makes sense to invest in a lot of African states because they've reached the right level that investors need. Right, Mphatso, how does that sound to your ears? Would you say that it would be a problem to find the right projects that you would invest your money in Malawi?
Well, maybe the question would not be, would it be difficult to find the right things to invest in? I think when I look at Malawi, we have massive challenges, which from a business perspective, those are really great opportunities. But when we talk about infrastructural growth, so let me just, infrastructural investment, let me just give you the simple example that I gave of the machine that I just bought. If that machine breaks down and it has no supporting industry, it means that I have to go back to the Chinese guy to look for parts in China and sell them to me. So when we talk about infrastructure development, I think it would also be very critical. Imagine if the larger population of Malawi is illiterate. On my farm, I cannot hire capable skills to just milk a cow and understand the hygiene that is required to have good quality milk. Why? Because we do not have that type of capacity. So the distance between building really beautiful roads that lead somewhere and building the human development, those are two very different things, because you can put infrastructure, hard infrastructure in place, but then Malawians are not participating in the type of development that we're talking about. So again, I am privileged because I can see the opportunities on the grassroots and I can also see the opportunities outside. But most Malawians do not have that type of privilege. That's why I am saying that it's very important to have organic conversation about development. Malawi and Ghana are two very different countries. The population of Malawi, the land mass in Malawi is way different than Ghana. And our histories are also very different. So the history of the US, for example, if I give you the example of women's rights, is very specific to the US because of specific events that happened in that society. Now, Malawi is also its own unique society. And that's why I'm saying that it's very important for development partners to hear the Malawian story. So for me, it's not necessarily about the baggage that we're carrying in terms of our colonial history. That's not the issue. The issue is if, for example, you are a woman and all of a sudden you get the power to get to the table where men are, there's discomfort. It's the same way with race. It's the same way with inequality between countries. So we still are having other countries tell us what is best for us. So for me, I go back again to the issue of migration. I look at the German citizen who has worked hard for their money that day and take some of the taxpayers' money and send it to Africa. When that money comes to Africa, I think it's the obligation it's the African citizens' obligation to take that money seriously and to develop, to let the money do its job. And why so? Because I think I am very ashamed to see young Africans going to Europe and suffering along the way just to get a decent life. Why is that? The question should not be from the outside, or the impetus should not be from the outside, but what are African countries doing to make sure that young Africans do not leave their countries? It's the same thing for Malawi. We have a lot of young Malawians going to South Africa. Now, is that a problem that is going to remain static? No, but I think it's a conversation worth having. And I think it's a conversation worth having with young Malawians. And I would ask, maybe this would be my ask from having this conversation, that maybe we need to fund these type of conversations to happen in our country, so that people in our country begin to have the same conversations that other people are having in their own nations. So for me, this coming month, we are having the first rural development meeting in my village, in our language, so that I appreciate the culture here and the way people do things. And I begin to hear their voice as to what development happens to them. I mean, what development means to them. Because essentially, when I get to the table, because I'm educated, I automatically shut them off, because they have indirectly learned that the people who speak are people who are educated. It's the same way that we Africans have also learned that it's the donors that speak at the table. It's not the African. So there are so many African states, we are mentioning a few that are benefiting right now. It's not so much to downplay on Afrika First or the social economy, but I believe in the principles of the social economy. But I think that we still need an African voice, an African impetus to do that, because democracy looks very different in the US. It looks very different in Malawi. It looks very different because we are different people. We function different. Our cultures are different. We find different things in our lives important. Therefore, I really think that it's important to accept and appreciate the inequalities that create gaps between us as human beings and overcome them by getting over the fence into the other side, like I am doing in my own community, because I understand that I stand with privilege. And because I stand with privilege, I must go on the other side to facilitate my own listening. I have the privilege to go lobby on national level, lobby into policies because I'm educated, but they will never have that chance. So the important thing then is to bring them to the table. Imagine that's 80% of Malawians. If their voice is not on the table, then whose development is it? So I really think that at the end of the day, the global policies, I understand the geopolitics, I understand the concerns of Germany, and I think they are real. And I think it is very important for Germany to position itself, but so is it important for African countries to also have a voice, to come to the table and meet the Germans.
Die andere Perspektive einzunehmen als Tipp und
yeah, so looking at things from somebody else's perspective. That actually sounds like a good tip to the politicians who are about to negotiate the next German government now. And yeah, to some extent, your positions seem a little apart. Daniel, we're 1 hour in, so we are approaching the end of our session here. But Mphatso has described what she would like to see. And the question is, how do we look at Africa, at Malawi, and how do we perceive the differences between countries? Mphatso said that Ghana and Malawi are very different, and we often also talk about Nigeria and Egypt, which are also completely different. You know, Nigeria with the mega cities, which don't exist in Malawi, I take it. So yeah, we should be mindful of the fact that Africa is a continent with a wide range of different countries with different conditions and cultures. So, Daniel, let's take a look at things from a German perspective. So in Germany, we may get a new coalition, a new government. Would that mean that there's going to be a new development policy as well? Would you expect that? And that's quite important. That'll play a role. So how do you look at the current coalition negotiations, coalition talks, and what would you like to see in Germany? Well, I am being, say, cautiously optimistic. I think it's quite exciting that the Greens and the Liberals are talking to each other right now, also with a view to foreign policy. Both of these parties have similar ideas in terms of development aid. They are saying that the European development banks should be used more strongly to mobilize capital. So the paradigm shift that Development Minister Gerd Müller drove forward can be clearly seen here. And he said we mustn't forget, you know, the economic aspects of development aid, and this is something that could certainly be continued under a green liberal government. And maybe I can bridge the gap to something that Mphatso said. I look at things, you know, as an economist geopolitically. And if we want to establish a joint economic area with our reform partners, then we need to spend more time talking to each other at different levels. And I have one specific request to the German coalition partners, namely, it would be nice if they decided to establish an institutionalized dialogue between European and African partners, not just at a political level, but also in civil society and through the development banks. Because in addition to all these economic and geopolitical ideas, we need to establish a close exchange. We need to talk to each other more in order to really address the different ideas we have and in order to explain to each other what we are expecting from each other. And if we were to establish such an institutionalized dialogue between Europe and Africa across different levels, that would be a great future project. Okay, so today we started out on at a very small level. Mphatso, over to you for a final comment. I mean, most of our viewers are now, well, most of the people watching here probably haven't been to Malawi. So you can do two things for Malawi here. Tell us why we have to come to Malawi by all means. What makes the people in Malawi so special? What makes this country so special?
Okay, so Malawi has an extremely beautiful lake, freshwater lake, with one of the one of the most tasty fish, which is tilapia. I'm sure that you cannot find that taste anywhere. You need to come to Malawi to taste our tilapia. And not only that, we are the warm heart of Africa. If you come to Malawi, you bet that we will welcome you the Malawian way, and you will reconsider being a German citizen. So come visit us. You're most welcome to Malawi. Thank you.
Das ist doch wunderbar. Daniel, du siehst mir jetzt nach, dass ich...
Excellent. Daniel, please bear with me. I mean, you live in Düsseldorf, so bear with me that I'm not asking you what's so special about Düsseldorf that everybody needs to go there. Thank you very much for this wonderful event. Thank you to Mphatso for giving us such interesting insights into her country. Thanks to Daniel as well. And well, today was just the start. We are going to do more of these online forums. And I think tonight we've seen that sometimes we're dealing with very complex issues. You can look at things, you know, from different personal perspectives, and the topics vary as well. And therefore, it doesn't come as a surprise that we end up having a checklist that we can all tick off. But we've all agreed that dialogue is possible, and we would like to continue it. And that's why, for now, I would like to thank the two of you, dear Mphatso and Daniel. Hello to Düsseldorf and hello to Malawi. And I would also like to mention here, some of the upcoming events have also been mentioned on the chat. So there's more to come. Oh, there's a fly here in my office. Anyway, so let me make sure that I'm giving you the right information. The next event on Africa will be on the 4th of November, if I see it correctly. This will be about Ethiopia. And then we will talk to Astra Asarata, the nephew of the last Ethiopian emperor, a highly educated partner to talk about Ethiopia and Africa in general. And we will also speak with the development policy spokesperson of the Free Liberals. And with that, I would like to thank you very much to all those who made today's event possible. That's the Friedrich Naumann Foundation office in Lower Saxony, but also the international Friedrich Naumann team that put us in touch with Mphatso. Thanks to Daniel and the co-author of his book, Martin Schoeller. I mean, this book actually was the kicker why we arranged today's meeting. And thanks to our two wonderful simultaneous interpreters and the technicians as well. It all went through very well. Good job. And now I wish you all a very nice evening. All the best, and hello to all the world. Goodbye.